Hello chess friends, I hope you're doing well. In this particular game, I faced off against Takano, a tactical master, playing with the black pieces. Through this video, I'll be teaching you about chess openings, strategies, and tactics. Let's dive right in without further delay. Takano starts the game with a c4 move, which is called the English opening, where he has multiple options to progress in the game by moving out his knight or pushing the e or d pawns to their natural squares. Therefore, black opts for e6 or e5 sometimes and brings out their knights in their usual squares, but here I decided to play e6, which is called the agincourt defense. So after d4, you can see that this move is also like when white plays d4 e6, c4, it is a similar opening choice. At this point, black sometimes plays the knight to f6, which is absolutely playable, but then after the knight here, then d5 black can immediately strike in the center with the c5 move, which is just mind-blowing and a dominating move. However, at this point, instead of moving out my knight, I decided to play bishop to b4 check. He blocks the check with his knight on c3, but I think bishop to d2 would have been the best move to consider because this knight is very important and crucial for managing the center and valuable squares. However, this bishop is not as important as the knight. So, at this point, we have pawn to b6, and I want to play knight to f6, pawn to d5, and the bishop can go to this diagonal. Furthermore, I can even play pawn to f5 to control the central squares, which is significant in my opening strategy. After queen c2 and bishop b7, we have pawn to a3, and I decide to exchange pieces on the c3 square, after f5 happened in the game to control the e4 square and considering the knight for the e4 outpost, playing pawn to f3 to protect that square is not crucial because it can lead to positional weakness on the kingside. After playing e3 and knight to f6, he decides to play pawn to f3 because these pawn moves are significant in controlling that square so the knight cannot come into the center. But at the same time, it creates a vulnerable situation around the kingside where my queen can potentially come to the h4 square. So, at this point, if you decide to play any normal move after I play knight to h5, for instance, if you decide to play bishop to e2 followed by knight h3 and castling, then I can immediately strike with queen to h4 check. No matter where the king goes, for instance, if the king goes to d2, then I can make a destructive position by playing queen to f2, invading and attacking along with the rook and the pawn. Some may consider playing pawn to g3, but this is not a good move as I can attack the pawn by playing knight takes g3, the knight attacks the rook and prepares for a check simultaneously, making your position completely vulnerable. To protect against this vulnerability, he decided to play knight to h3 to secure his kingside. I responded immediately by playing pawn to a5, which is a great and valuable move to consider in the opening. After bishop to e2 was played to prepare for short castle, I countered by playing queen to h4. Subsequently, after pawn to a4 was played, it significantly strategizes my queenside position, allowing my rook to invade on h5 through a5 and create a potential outpost for my knight by moving it to c6, then to a5 and b3 squares with support from the pawn. Additionally, it sets up for the bishop to a6 to control the diagonal effectively, making pawn to a4 a crucial and efficient move to consider pushing. After short castle and castle, we have bishop to d2, knight c6 with the idea of playing knight to a5 followed by knight b3. Additionally, I can even move my pawn to the f4 square to break open the kingside. So, he decided to play bishop to d1 to protect that knight on the b3 square. After d6, knight to h3 happened in the game, increasing protection against the pawn push on the f4 square. After the queen moves back, some might consider playing pawn to f4, but this move will create a positional weakness on the e4 and g4 squares. Therefore, I can re-maneuver my knight to f6 to access these squares. I can even play knight to a5, followed by knight b3, and your bishop can't protect both knights simultaneously. At this position, we have rook to e1 to open the e-file by pushing the e-pawn. After the knight moves, we have bishop to c2 to push the e-pawn. After the queen slides, the rook moves here, and we have e5 striking in the center. Some might consider playing pawn takes e5, which looks natural, but after I capture it, the bishop moves back. I can even sacrifice my bishop on the f3 square, which is crucial to expose your kingside completely. Now, I can capture the pawn with a fork, pick up your rook, and consider going to c6 check. If the king moves, then the queen will go to the f3 square to attack the knight, and my knight can jump into the g4 square immediately. I can involve my rook on the g6 square, followed by rook f6, creating a positional weakness for you. For instance, if you play knight to f2, I will go with knight e4, and after you capture, I can even recapture it. Rook f6, rook g6 is unstoppable, and your kingside is completely exposed. But don't worry when Stockfish is the boss. Let me make a quote for you. Believe in yourself. You are braver than you think, more talented than you know, and capable of more than you imagine. Returning to the position, we observed that pawn takes e5 was a bad move. Some may consider playing pawn to d5, which can lock the position immediately but also block all attacks and your pawn structure, demobilizing your pieces. After he plays knight to f2, and after we have rook e8, pawn to d5, we have knight e7, queen to b4 to increase pressure against the a-pawn, and he's considering playing bishop to c3 to access the center. A couple of moves later, when I played knight to g6 and moved the bishop to c8, my pieces are maneuvering in the kingside. The bishop is anchored to this diagonal, the knight is coming there, and both knights are creating potential and efficient attacks in the kingside. Even I can maneuver my queen to e8, followed by queen to g6 to access the g-file or move up my rook to increase pressure against the g-file or push the f4 pawn strategically. After knight d3 happened, queen e8, he immediately strikes in the center by playing pawn to f4. However, pawn f4 creates a positional weakness on the e4 and g4 squares where my knight can easily disrupt your position by accessing these squares. After I played knight to e4, attacking your bishop, and after the captures happened in the center, he again strikes in the center with c5, with the idea of mobilizing his pieces and activating his bishop. At this point, I played a bold strategic and cunning move by maneuvering my rook to the f6 square, initiating an attack on the king's side and protecting the b6 pawn from capture. Subsequently, he decided to lock down the position completely by advancing his pawn to the c6 square. This move disrupted the bishop's diagonal and deactivated its effectiveness. However, it also demobilized all of white's pieces, rendering them unable to attack effectively. I responded with another strategic move, moving my bishop to a6 to control the a6 to f1 diagonal, which will be crucial in disrupting the king's position in the future. After e1, I played knight to h4 to further attack the king's side. However, this move wasn't possible due to the knight fork on f3. The best move for white at this point would be to consider knight takes e5 with support from the bishop. Then, I planned to execute a cunning and brilliant move with knight takes g2. Sacrificing the knight on the g2 square right on the board and, at this juncture, playing knight takes e4 was the best move. However, if you dare to capture the knight on g2 square out of a lusty desire, I can invade with an attack by placing my rook on g6. After the capture and recapture in the game, you can see that your king's position is completely vulnerable and exposed. The knight is controlling significant squares, and the bishop's role is to seize that diagonal, leading to checkmate in a few moves. For instance, if you play king to h1, then it will be checkmate in one move by placing my knight on the f2 square. So, returning to the position, although knight takes e5 was the best move, but he approached it in another way by placing his knight on the f2 square and attacking the knight on e4, but it is a complete blunder and a garbage move as it provides me an open diagonal for my bishop. This is why I initiate a heavy attack by placing my rook on g6 on the g2 pawn. At this point, some may think of playing pawn to g3, but it is a completely rubbish move as I can play knight to f3, forking. Some may also think of playing knight takes e4, which looks good and natural, but I can execute a destructible position for you by capturing the pawn on g2, forcing the king to move to the h1 square. Afterward, I can play queen to h5, invading and attacking the h2 square. After the knight moves to g3, I can place my queen on f3 to launch a discovered attack on the king's side, and your position will be completely lost. Returning to the position, we saw that knight takes e4 was a very bad choice. Also, playing pawn to g3 is also a bad move, which is why he decided to play pawn to g3. Why did he decide to play pawn to g3? It is a completely bad move because it provides me with the f3 square for free access, which is why I decided to play knight to f3. His position is completely disrupted and corrupted after the king moves up. I played rook to h6 to attack the h2 pawn. Some might consider capturing the knight on f3 square, but it can create a vulnerable position around your king's side. Afterward, I am going to give you a check on h5, pawn to g4, and knight to g5 check. The bishop is controlling that square, which is why the king has to move to the g3 square, and it will be checkmate in one move after I capture the pawn on h2. The game will be completely over. We saw that king takes f3 was a bad move, along with the rook to h1 move to protect that square because knight h4 is a big threat to sacrifice himself to open up the diagonal for the queen on g6 square, so at this point, he decided to play pawn to h3 in order to protect that square. I decided to initiate an attack by capturing the knight on the f2 square, creating a precarious situation for you. Playing king takes f3 would result in a similar scenario. After capturing the pawn on h3 and king takes f2 occurred, I launched a heavy attack by placing my queen on the h5 square. The rook, queen, along with the bishop, created a vulnerable situation around your king side, potentially leading to checkmate in a few moves. At this point, he decided to capture the knight on the f2 square. Subsequently, I played queen to h5 to protect that knight and threatened to capture the pawn on h2 square. Some might consider playing pawn to h4, but that would be a bad move as I could strengthen my position by placing my pawn on e4 and queen on h4 square. Others might consider playing rook to h1 to protect that pawn, but I could counter with a heavy attack by initiating my knight on g5, preparing for the f3 check. If your bishop moves to the d3 square, I can give you a check, leading to a series of checks where king to g1 is not possible due to queen takes rook on d1. Playing king to e1 would result in losing your rook and a positional weakness in your vulnerable square, giving me a decisive advantage. He then played queen to e7 to safeguard his position. I responded by playing knight to g5 to prepare for the queen f3 check, along with the bishop seizing that diagonal. A while back, I played bishop to a6 to control the diagonal by advancing my pawn, providing me a strategic maneuver in this position. After he played pawn to h4 to attack my knight, I countered with queen to f3 check. The bishop controlled that square, so after the king moved back, I gave this check, leading to a series of checks that culminated in a checkmate by playing rook takes h4, rendering your position hopeless and ending the game. So let me motivate you by sharing a beautiful quote. This page might not be your favorite, but the next chapter of your life will be incredible. Returning to the position, we saw queen takes g5, and after capturing your queen, he immediately played h4 to force my queen out. But I replied, "Hey, I am Stockfish, god of chess in the Milky Way galaxy. I decided to sacrifice my rook on h4 square to expose your king completely, taking advantage of the open diagonal. It exposes the king completely, and by playing pawn to f4, I can even move my rook to the f8 square to intensify the attack on the king's side. So, in this position, after the king moves back, I launch an attack by pushing my pawn to f4, and after the capture-recapture sequence, you can see that my pawn becomes a passed pawn, and with control of the bishop, I create a much more decisive position for black. After the bishop moves, a queen check comes on g3 square, the king goes to h1, and I play pawn to f3 to checkmate in one move. Even if you try to protect against the checkmate with your rook, queen to h3 is unstoppable. Additionally, my bishop protects the f1 square, preventing the rook from recapturing the pawn, which is why he decides to capture the pawn on f3, as it is the only move available. My rook then goes to the f8 square, and some might consider saving the bishop by placing it on e4, but that's a bad move, as I can play rook to f2, and the checkmate is unstoppable from there. After the rook moves to e3, I capture the bishop, and you can see that you cannot recapture it, because I can recapture it on f3, creating a vulnerable situation for the rook and the king. After the rook check, the king moves up, and after a few more moves, we have a series of checks. Rook to h3, and the bishop blocks it. Queen takes rook, and after a few more moves, it's a checkmate on the f1 square. What a spectacular and wonderful game. In the game summary, we can say that in the English opening, we fianchettoed the bishop, and a few moves later, he played f3, but this f3 move created significant weaknesses on his king's side. A few moves later, I played a5, followed by a4. These moves created a significant role for my bishop, controlling the diagonal. My knight reinforced itself on c6, followed by knight to a5, then knight to b4. After a few more moves, I played bishop to a6 to activate the bishop within this diagonal, which played a crucial and significant role. What a mind-blowing and spectacular game. By sacrificing the rook, it led to a checkmate, evident through time. If you enjoyed my content, please like and subscribe to my channel. Wishing you all the best. Bye bye, see you.